Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of WWF-India and CDP India, myself, Varun Agarwal, I welcome you all in this webinar today on Science-Based Targets Incubator, an initiative by WWF-India and CDP in India, funded by the Shakti Foundation. So we hope all of you are staying indoors and staying safe in India in these unprecedented times when this virus has stuck us unprepared, I'd say. And with this webinar, we hope that we can throw some light on the climate crisis that stands right on the door, and how we can do our bit being responsible corporates and responsible businesses in India, and we can take our pledges through the Science-Based Targets initiative, and we can somehow mitigate the impacts of the perils of climate change that stands right next to our doors, which will not even allow us to stay safe in our homes when the climate crisis strikes us. So without further ado, I would like to put forth the agenda for today's webinar. So we have two presentations today, and we have the fortune of having Mr. Alexander Farsan, who's a global lead science-based targets initiative globally for WWF International. He's here with us, and he would be giving us a macro level overview and an introduction to the science-based targets initiative, and would throw light on the various aspects of science-based targets internationally, and why the science-based targets are important for businesses all across the world, and how the initiative is shaping up. Further to this, WWF India and CDP India, myself and Ms. Subodhika Vora from CDP would take you through the nitty-gritties of the Science-Based Targets Incubator, the initiative which has been launched in India to enhance the uptake of science-based targets in India, and have more and more businesses take up the voluntary targets to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in line with the climate science. We would also take you through a brief journey of the science-based targets here in India, and throw light on various organizations who are doing their bit and who have already taken pledge under the science-based targets to take up the voluntary targets, so that their emissions are in line with the climate science, which says that we need to limit our emissions to keep the Earth's temperature well beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. So without wasting much time, we'll quickly dig deeper into the science-based targets overview, and I'll hand it over to Alex. Alex, you can start your presentation and take us through the journey of science-based targets and across the world, and share your views with us. Just to mention, Alex will be available with us only for the first 30 minutes of the webinar. So the questions that you have with regards to Alex's presentation, you can post your questions during his presentation, and we would try and take up as many questions as we can till 3:30 before we begin the next presentation. Alex, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Varun. Thank you everybody who's dialed in today in what I know is a challenging time for all of us. So really appreciate that you take the time for the webinar. And thanks so much for the colleagues in India at CDP and WWF for inviting me to speak and giving me a few minutes to present the SBTI. And of course, thank you to Shakti Foundation for supporting us and enabling this exciting initiative to take off. And it's particularly close to my heart because I lived in India for a long time myself. So it's really great to see that there's increasing and growing momentum around science-based targets. So I'm really excited that this initiative is taking off. So without further ado, I'd like to start my presentation with this, which might sound a little, might look a little counterintuitive. And what we're seeing are two pictures of the very same streets in New York City. On the left side, it's Easter morning in 1900. It's Fifth Avenue, and the game we play is Spot the Car. And if you take a close look, I actually include a visual aid. There's a red circle around the one car on that street, and everything else is horse carriages. And then on the right side, you see that very same street exactly 13 years later. And of course, we no longer need a visual aid to spot the cars. It's completely packed with automotive vehicles. So I think this is actually a powerful way of illustrating the role of businesses in climate change. On the one hand, it shows the responsibility of businesses. It's emblematic of the role the fossil fuel economy has taken in our global economy. Almost every corner of the global economy is now driven by resources that are carbon intense. But if you take a little bit of a closer look, it's also a huge symbol of the power of business to drive innovation and then to deploy that innovation at scale. If you think about it, it's crazy that in 13 years, in the largest city of the world at that time, the dominant mode of transport for hundreds of years in horse carriages had been completely displaced by a new technology because the technology was considered better and was more useful. So it's really this combination of responsibility of businesses who are responsible for a large part of global greenhouse gas emissions and their ability to deploy innovations at scale that make them the critical actor in global climate action. Because on the one hand, they're a big part of the problem, but on the other hand, they have a unique ability to solve the problem. And there's actually another angle here that's interesting for a business to understand, and that's the angle of risk. Because imagine if you were a horse carriage manufacturer in New York in the early 20th century. You certainly didn't have a good first decade. And it's spotting these opportunities or these risks early, which makes businesses successful. And you can already see what happens if you take this engine of innovation and scale and point in the right direction to make sure that it's part of the solution rather than the problem. These are numbers from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, a research arm of Bloomberg looking at renewable energy and renewable electricity. And if you look at it without going into much detail, the numbers are, of course, staggering. The development of prices for some of the key low carbon technologies over the last decade have seen dramatic drops in price. That starts with solar PV modules that have reduced in price by over 94% over the last decade. Onshore wind turbines have dropped by almost 40% over the last decade, and lithium-ion batteries, of course, with storage, a critical aspect of it, by 85% over the last decade. And the exciting thing is that we can see from these underlying learning rates that this is not the end of the trend. This is just the middle of the development, and we're going to continue seeing these prices drop, enabling the low carbon transition. And it's businesses that are starting to see the opportunity here that are really starting to make the difference and are embracing this transition as an opportunity for them to continue to stay successful businesses. IKEA, for example, the largest furniture manufacturer in the world, which I think also just recently started opening its first stores in India, has pledged to reduce the emissions of every product by 70% by 2030. And critically, this is not only the emissions from its own operations, but the entire value chain emissions. So it's working with its suppliers, with its designers, and with its customers to drive these emission reductions across the entire life cycle of the product. Carlsberg, one of the largest breweries in the world, but also a large industrial company. Carlsberg brews around 3 pints of beer for every person in the world every year across 85 breweries. So huge industrial operation, and they have committed to reducing emissions at its breweries to 0 by 2030, so to completely eliminate emissions in its breweries. And Ørsted, one of the largest utilities in Europe, formerly Dong Energy, Danish oil and natural gas, Dong, and they've renamed themselves to Ørsted several years ago, but they didn't just rebrand. They actually completely changed their business model from a fossil fuel dependent power generation to becoming the largest offshore wind producer in the world. And when they've completed their transition in 2025, they're going to have reduced the emissions per kilowatt hour of electricity produced by 98%. So you're seeing that some of the world's leading businesses are actually embracing this transition and using it as an opportunity to really make their business future-proof. And what all of these targets have in common is that they're science-based targets. They've been developed under the umbrella of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And this is, of course, what we're talking about today. The Science-Based Targets Initiative is a collaboration between 4 organizations, CDP, the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And the mission of the Science-Based Targets Initiative is to make science-based target setting standard business practice. So what is a science-based target? A science-based target is essentially taking the information from climate science and climate scenarios and translating it down to an individual company's level to help the company understand at what rate and at what scale it has to reduce its emissions to contribute to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I will talk a little bit more about what that means in practice later, but it's essentially translating climate science to the level of individual actor to understand how much should an individual business contribute to do its fair share. And the SBTI has three key streams of activity. On the one hand, we develop methods and guidance and tools to help businesses set science-based targets and to enable businesses to set science-based targets. We promote science-based target setting as a powerful tool by highlighting those businesses that have set science-based targets, but also by promoting science-based targets to investors, to regulators, really to a broader audience to make sure everybody speaks the same language and sees science-based targets as a shortcut for understanding whether a business is actually taking credible climate action or not. And then finally, we have an independent assurance mechanism. So we validate targets that companies submit to the SBTI against a catalog of criteria to decide whether or not they are following best practice in science-based targets. So how can businesses actually join the Science-Based Targets Initiative? It's essentially a four-step process. The first one is just committing to setting a science-based target. And that's quite a simple step. You just have to sign a letter and send it to the SBTI, and then you will already be recognized publicly for having made this commitment that you do want to take climate action in line with science. And you will already show up on our website. Then you have 24 months to complete the next 3 steps. First of all, of course, is developing the targets. And that can involve quite a bit of technical analysis, particularly if you haven't done a lot of the greenhouse gas footprinting for your business. That is the baseline for this. And so it means you kind of understand the footprint of your business across your operations, but also across your value chain. And then you apply the right methods to understand what the reductions are that are applicable to your business. You then submit your targets to the SBTI, and there's a target submission form that we have. You can download on our website where you fill in all the relevant information, and then the SBTI checks the validity of the target against its criteria, which are of course all public. And then finally, when your business gets the approval, you will, with our support, announce the targets. We will highlight you on our website as targets set, and you will be able to communicate to your customers, to your investors, to your stakeholders that you have set science-based targets and you're taking climate action in line with science. And a lot of businesses are already doing this. The SBTI was founded in the middle of 2015, just as we were coming up to the COP21 in Paris. And since then, over 840 companies have joined the Science-Based Targets Initiative. As you can see, momentum is accelerating. So over the last 6 months, we had over 30 companies per month, or more than 1 company per day. And of these 840 companies, almost 350 have already had their targets approved. So have gotten the targets signed off through this target validation process. So you're really seeing the momentum continuing to grow, and it is on its way to becoming standard business practice in many places. One thing to highlight, of course, is that this is not the same across the entire world. Different places have seen a different pace of pickup. And as you can see here, particularly strong penetration we've seen in places like North America, in Europe, in Japan. And then we see a lot of first movers in other places. And actually India, and I'm sure Svt'S is going to go in a lot more detail, among all emerging markets, India is the leading market in picking up science-based targets. There's a number of really leading companies that have already set the targets, are already taking climate action in a science-based way. And we're hoping that with the support of our great colleagues in India, this is going to continue to increase over the next years. So why are businesses setting science-based targets? Don't take it from us. We of course have our reasons, but we actually went out and asked executives at companies who have set science-based targets to help us understand what they see as the benefits of setting a science-based target. So this was a survey that about 200 executives from companies with science-based targets answered. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but some of them I think are really worth highlighting. On the one hand, of course, I think it's driving innovation because it really changes the perspective that companies take on their climate targets. Historically, companies have taken a incremental short-term view on targets. They've tried to understand what are the low-hanging fruits to implement carbon reductions in the next few years. They've looked at the payback period of a few projects and then essentially rolled out a plan that looked at the next 3 to 4 years and had modest, often, emission reductions. Now, with the emission reductions that are required in the SBTi, which are 5 to 15-year targets with often quite substantial emission reductions, it really shifts your view, and you have to understand what is the best way for us of getting to this target. And what that does is it makes you think in more innovative ways. You start talking to different parts of the business. You try to understand what are the real opportunities we have to align our business model with these emission reductions. And as you can see, almost 2/3 of businesses have really seen a surge in innovation because of setting these science-based targets. And another one I think that's really critical to highlight is investor confidence. You're seeing increasingly that investors are concerned about whether or not a business understands the risks that they're exposed to from climate change. So once again, if you were a horse carriage manufacturer in the early 20th century, there probably was good reason to be afraid of being disrupted. And in a way, it's a huge luxury because it's really rarely that a business can see a disruption coming from a distance. But we already know that we're going to make this low carbon transition. So investors also understand this and want businesses to take credible action and translate them into credible commitments. So over 50% of the companies we talked to said they've got very positive signals from investors. They have taken these targets and taken the step to make this transition. And then finally, of course, we've seen almost 80% of companies getting their brand reputation boosted. So it's obviously a huge positive boost to a company's reputation if they're being seen as taking credible action on perhaps the defining issue of this century. We do have a blog post on our website if you want to dig a little bit more into these benefits. And there's also a manual on our website that helps you understand a little bit of how to build a business case. And this will touch upon some of these areas as well. So what does it actually mean to the science-based target? What are the key steps here? And this is quite a complex topic. There's quite a lot of methodological depth behind it. And obviously our colleagues with CDP India and WWF-India are happy to help you in more detail. But for now, it's suffice to say it's a 3-step process. On the one hand, the question is, what is actually the global carbon budget that we have left? And that will depend on the temperature goal that you choose. So the global carbon budget is essentially the amount of carbon or greenhouse gases that we have left to emit if you want to stay within a certain temperature goal. And whether you aim for a 1.5 degree target, so limiting global warming to 1.5, or well below 2 degrees Celsius, obviously will make a difference in how much carbon there's left. So you can choose which temperature goal you want to align with under the SBTi. We support both of the goals under the Paris Agreement. And the next step, and that's probably where the SBTi has done the most work, is allocating this carbon budget out to an individual company. And we essentially have 2 principal ways of doing this. There is a global sector agnostic approach where we essentially translate the global carbon budget directly down to an individual company. And this is actually the method that most companies have chosen. It's called the absolute contraction approach, where you essentially reduce your emissions in line with the global rate of decarbonization that is required. And then we also have a second pillar of methods, which are sector-specific methods. And those are not necessarily available for all sectors, but for a number of sectors, we have sector-specific methods that actually then translate the global carbon budget down to the sectoral level. So there's sector budgets, and then companies within a sector can set their targets leaning onto these sectoral budgets. And then the third step is, once you've understood what your carbon budget is, or what your share is, you need to understand how fast do I have to reduce emissions to actually stay within my carbon budget. And that's where you get your targets. You understand what your budget is, you understand what your baseline footprint is, and then you understand how much you have to reduce over time. And that is, I think, all I wanted to cover in this short time this afternoon, but I'll be very happy to take some questions, and also know that our great colleagues in India will be able to provide much more detail to all of these aspects of the SBTi. I think
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. Thanks for the presentation and taking us through the overview of Science-Based Targets Initiative and sharing your insights with us. So we do have a couple of questions coming in on your presentation, and I request all the participants to type in their questions as well. And the first question is, though it's a very generic question, but I would still like you to answer this. Is there any tool or guideline that is available to develop the science-based targets?
Yes, there is actually. So on our website, you will find a whole suite of resources, and I'm sure we will cover this in more detail in some of our follow-up sessions, or maybe even today. I think the first resource to really use is something called the Science-Based Target Setting Manual, which has a step-by-step overview of the steps a company should go through to set science-based targets. It also includes kind of links to all the key resources around the baseline footprinting. And once you've understood the basic principles and methods, we also have an Excel tool that helps businesses calculate the emission reductions that need to happen within their targets. So I would say first look at the SBT manual, which is a more higher level overview of all the key steps. And once you've read that, you're probably ready to take on the Excel sheet, which isn't necessarily user-friendly if you haven't previously engaged. And then there's, to be honest, a number of different resources on our website. I would encourage you to just go to sciencebasedtargets.org and look at the resources page, which gives a good overview of the things that we have out at the moment.
Thanks, Alex. So there's another question, and the participant wants to know that does the science-based target allow carbon offsetting?
Yeah, thanks very much for this question. It's very often asked. The SBTi does not allow offsetting to count against the emissions, and that's following the greenhouse gas protocol, where emission reductions are reported separately across the scopes 1, 2, and 3, and then offsets are supposed to be recorded separately. This doesn't mean that offsets cannot represent meaningful mitigation action, but there is a strong priority for businesses to take responsibility of their own emissions and drive emission reductions. We actually have an interesting paper on the website, on the page that I just mentioned, and the name is Towards a Science-Based Approach to Carbon Neutrality. And that really lays out the argument quite clearly why there just is a difference between reducing your own emissions or helping others reduce emissions through offsetting. Both are important, but one does not trade off the other.
Thanks, Alex. Very well answered. And also, just another question: like, how do we take in all the Scope 3 emissions in setting the science-based targets? What are the criteria, the macro level criteria for factoring in the Scope 3 emissions?
Yes, another very often asked question. And it's probably the most challenging aspect for a lot of businesses that haven't thought about this before. So in a nutshell, and there's more detail to this, the first step is understanding through a high-level screening what your Scope 3 footprint is roughly. And then the criteria is that if they're significant, you do have to set science-based targets for them, or ambitious targets for them. Specifically, it means if your Scope 3 emissions are more than 40% of your Scope 1, 2, and 3 combined emissions, you will have to have a Scope 3 target. Then for Scope 3 targets, you have to cover at least 2/3 of your Scope 3 emissions. So you don't have to cover all of them, but 2/3. And then there is a number of different routes to set those targets. So we have absolute emission reduction targets, we have intensity reduction targets, we have supplier engagement targets. So this is a topic that actually will require a lot more depth. And I'm assuming it's going to be one of the follow-up sessions we're going to have within the program, because it often is the most challenging part for businesses that haven't worked in it before. But there is a lot of good smart ways of addressing scope 3 that can help you at least mitigate some of the barriers and pain points.
Thanks, Alex. Another interesting one. So how do the companies decide which approach to take on for setting the science-based targets?
I think it's a little bit of a question of what fits their general business model the best. I mean, first point really is that not for all businesses is there a sector-specific approach. So then obviously the choice is limited in that sense. But then it's also a question of how you generally frame your strategy, and it will kind of be a longer discussion sometimes to understand what fits the way the business has its strategy laid out best. And it will be quite an individual one-to-one conversation, which again, I think we're happy to have with industry competence.
Thanks, Alex. Also another one on, are biogenic emissions considered carbon neutral?
So actually, again, a very good question. So for now, biogenic emissions from biofuel stock, we don't have specific guidance on how to account for them. We do allow companies to, we ask companies to put them in a boundary, and both the emissions and the removals. And then if they choose to account for them carbon neutral, then we currently accept this. I think an important point to raise here is that there is just emerging a greenhouse gas protocol development process to provide additional guidance on accounting for emissions and removals related to the land system, removals more generally, and also accounting for bioenergy. So if you go to the greenhouse gas protocol website, and I'm sure we can send out the detail following this webinar, there is basically a process now to decide the rules on how businesses should account for biogenic emissions. So long story short, for now, companies can certainly account for bioenergy as carbon neutral. There will be more refined guidance on this over the next 12 to 18 months.
Thanks again, Alex. Another one question the participant wants to know, can the science-based targets be modeled on historic emissions?
So it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I fully understand it. So all greenhouse gas inventories are historic emissions. So you basically, the way the greenhouse gas protocol works is that a company accounts for all of its emissions over 1 year's time, and does so backward looking. So it actually accounts for actual emissions that happen. There is some limitations to how far back you can model your targets. So the most recent, so there's two elements to this. On the one hand, companies can choose baseline years as they would like, but the SBTi doesn't only measure the ambition between the baseline year and the target year, but also what we call the most recent year, to make sure that there's actually forward-looking ambition in the targets and they haven't already been achieved fully. So that most recent year can be up to 2 years from the year of submission. So for example, for if you submit a target in 2020, you could use 2018 baseline data to measure the most recent year.
All right, very well answered, Alex. Another one says, according to the latest updates in the methodology, the targets can be modeled. It says that we have to follow the 1.5 degree pathways, but is that the case, or companies can still follow the 2-degree pathway for modeling their targets?
The answer is somewhere in the middle of this. So it is not true that the minimum ambition is 1.5 C. We of course encourage companies to set 1.5 aligned targets, but we also understand the challenges of this. So we also allow companies to align with well below 2 degrees Celsius. That is slightly different from below 2 degrees Celsius, and I understand that that can be a little bit confusing, but there's essentially 3 tiers of ambition, and the 2C we no longer allow since last October, but the well below 2C we do allow. And if you're interested in understanding the difference more, we do have a paper on our website called Foundations of Science-Based Target Setting, and that explains which scenarios we've chosen to represent well below 2C and which scenarios we've chosen to represent 1.5C. So you don't have to align with 1.5, but the previous below 2C no longer is acceptable.
Thanks for answering the question, Alex. We are getting a lot of questions, and I believe, Alex, you need to jump off the webinar because of your
I can take a few more minutes if there's a few ones that you think are important.
Of course, then. So another question that we have is like for the heavy industries, do the scope 2 emissions need to include options like it's a very specific question. Do the scope 2 emissions need to include the waste heat recovery practices as well? Can this be done?
Well, it depends a little bit. So if the waste heat is from its own operations, then this would all be covered by scope 1 emissions. So you don't have to double count them, if that makes sense. If you do procure district heat or waste heat from a unrelated facility or plant, then there would be some allocation mechanism of allocating the emission intensity between the different sources of energy. It is a very technical question, so if you want to follow up in more detail, I'll be happy if you send us an email and I'll forward it or connect you to someone in our technical team to explain this in more detail.
Sure, I think that will be helpful, Alex. So we'll connect them to you. Thanks. And there's another interesting question on a bit technical though. If the carbon offsetting is not considered, then can a business become carbon neutral without changing their source of energy?
No, and I think that's exactly the point that we're trying to avoid.
Yes.
Is that businesses don't change the way they use energy, what type of energy they use, and to become carbon neutral. There is, of course, people that say that you're carbon neutral. You will find that those people are often the people that sell you the carbon credits. So you can make of that what you want.
All right. Thanks, Alex. So there are a couple of other questions which are quite specific, and I'd request the audience to not post like very specific questions. We can take these questions offline with you because they are quite specific, and their responses will vary and might not be applicable to all the audiences. And another one, does CCU fall in carbon offsetting, carbon capture and utilization?
No, so this is again a lot of good questions today. There's like the carbon capture aspect is almost certainly going to be counted as zero carbon, and then utilization obviously creates the question around who gets the benefit of the storage credits. And this is another point that's being addressed in this greenhouse gas protocol process that I just referenced. So the entire this entire spectrum around removals and CCS and BE, CCS, etc., how these all play out and who gets to account for what where, that hasn't really been fully resolved yet, but will be resolved in this GHGP process. So if you're interested, I would really recommend going to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website, signing up to the stakeholder consultation group, and making sure that you understand on the one hand what the conversation is, and also get a chance to provide input, because this is something that we're all still trying to figure out together.
Sure, very well answered, Alex. So I think another one, which again links to offsetting and even credits. So does buying credits and renewable energy certificate, does that serve as a right approach to become carbon neutral?
So we would encourage there to, carbon neutrality, I guess, is a broader question around the entire business. How to account for renewable electricity purchases through different routes is governed by something called the Scope 2 guidance. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has a specific guidance document for Scope 2 emissions, and that will actually set out the conditions under which a business can account for different types of electricity purchased as low carbon or not? So again, it's a broader question, and for probably a good hint for us to maybe also have a session around this within the incubator.
Sure, I think we can have another dedicated session on all the various ways in which this can be done. I think we can plan something for the next webinar for this, seeing the huge amount of interest from the audiences. So I think, Alex, that's all for today. Thank you for joining us and sharing your insights on the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and we hope that you'll join us for the next webinars as well. Thanks for your time.
Very happy to. And yeah, thanks again, everybody, for dialing in, and stay safe and stay home. Huh?
Sure.
Bye.
And we will share the resources that Alex had mentioned during answering the questions, the foundation papers and the white papers, which are available online on the various websites. We'll share the links with you for your future reference. So now we'd like to take you through the specific initiative that we have, the Science-Based Targets Initiative that has been launched by WWF-India and CDP India. And this is funded by the Shakti Foundation here in India. And through this initiative, we are trying to enhance the uptake of more and more businesses here in India into the Science-Based Targets Initiative. As Alex had already covered, that we already have 841 companies who have committed to SBTis globally, and out of these, we also have a fair amount of Indian companies who have enrolled, and we'll go through the details during the course of this presentation. Further to this, the vision that we have for the incubator, what we intend to do is that we need to enhance the uptake of this initiative in India and provide the hand-holding support and the various technicalities that are there with the initiative. We need to explain those to the Indian businesses who are quite not well versed with the various nitty-gritties and the technicalities of the climate science. So the incubator will help the companies to understand the process, to handhold through the entire process from signing up for the initiative to the validation of the targets. Both the organizations, WWF India and CDP India, will assist you through this journey. So we welcome you all to join the Science-Based Targets Incubator and sign up to the Science-Based Targets Initiative and take the pledge to reduce your GHG footprint, and in the process also take the advantage of the technical expertise that's available with these organizations in India, and also the global expertise that exists within the networks. So we are working on developing certain tools that would be specific, like the case studies and all of the Indian companies, which will be shared with you all, and so that you can learn about what motivated your peers to take up the science-based targets and how they fared through the journey and how they've been able to set up the science-based targets and get them validated, and they are now on a path of climate science-based emission reductions. So we are targeting high energy intensive companies in India, so which includes all the various sectors. Basically, it's open to all the businesses. We are looking at cement, metal, which includes iron and steel, aluminum, and other heavy metal businesses, automobile and engineering, pulp and paper, and also all the other businesses, FMCG, textiles, retail, services, and all other industries. The incubator is a joint collaboration, as I mentioned, between CDP and WWF India. And we are working on providing technical support to corporates who are interested in signing up for science-based targets, from signing up till validation, and also in the process facilitate the reduction of GHG emissions through the uptake of this initiative in the longer term. And our objective and our vision and our main motto behind the incubator is that businesses adopt this path of climate science-based emission reduction targets, and science-based targets in the longer term becomes the standard business practice. What we intend to do and the services that we are providing as a part of this initiative, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the incubator. So we are working on increasing the awareness on SBTs and setting the corporates on path of climate-based GHG reduction targets. For this, we will be doing capacity building workshops and webinars, which will be dedicated towards Indian businesses, and we'll be covering all the technical aspects of the Science-Based Targets Initiative and explaining and hand-holding the companies why they need to sign up and how they can go through this journey together with us. So we'll be focusing heavily on knowledge dissemination and peer-to-peer learning by facilitating interactions between the companies who already have signed up and who have validated targets, so that companies can learn from their peers and learn from their experiences and their knowledge. And we will also facilitate national and international best practices, the various case studies, and the various kinds of tools which are available internationally on the Science Based Targets website. So we'll ensure that all of those are understood and are well, you guys are well versed with the nitty-gritties of the various best practices and how you can take up the targets and what it takes to actually set the targets, starting from validating, say, beginning from reviewing your inventories and then guiding you on the process, like how and which approach to take for setting the targets, and to have based on your interest and expression of interest from the Indian businesses, we'll be also convening in-house trainings for you guys to increase the understanding of the SBTI framework and resources which are available, so that you can understand and also take up the initiative quickly, and also develop an understanding and train your staff, get your resources trained on taking up the initiative and setting the targets. So there will be hand-holding support that will be available, as I said, from signing up till validation. We'll help you submit your letters of intent and then getting yourself registered on the Science Based Targets Initiative portal with the Secretariat and doing the due diligence that would be required. And we would also be offering you support in terms of comms and all, to get the word out that you've signed up to the initiative with the standard comms package that we'll offer with the initiative, in addition to the technical support that the initiative will bring, that the incubator will offer to you, and also developing some macro level technical modules in the form of presentations and ready reckoners that you could use for enhancing your understanding of the Science Based Targets initiative. So there will be a full support, the Secretariat support, that will be available from WWF India to you for corporate uptake of the Science Based Targets. So you can reach out to us, you can write to us with your expression of interest that you are interested to sign up for Science Based Targets, and we can pretty much take it on from there. And with our partners, CDP India, who are supporting us, who are equal partners in this joint collaboration of Science Based Targets Incubator, they'll be helping you with the hardcore technical stuff on setting the targets and validating and taking you through the entire technical nitty-gritty of the process. So now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Ms. Subodhika Vora, Senior Technical Officer, CDP India, who will describe the process and who will also take you through the journey of Science Based Targets Initiative here in India.
Thank you, Varun. Could you please confirm if I'm audible?
Yes, Subodhika, you may proceed.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So like Alex and Varun have already given you an interview about the initiative and the incubator. So moving forward, I would like to just detail out the elements of the incubator and also, just deep dive into what the Indian scenario looks like, what the Indian companies are doing as part of the Science-Based Targets initiative at the moment. So as you can see, basically we would be providing you with technical assistance across these four heads, which is basically an inventory check of your GHG inventory across the scopes, then SBT target setting, modeling and development, then validation, and lastly, communications. So across each head, we have a certain list of things that we would be doing, and I'll just quickly take you through that. So when we say a GHG inventory check, is basically it means that you're doing quality checks of your inventory, understanding the company's organizational boundary and the emissions profile. Then direct and indirect scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, understanding the main sources of it that are contributing to your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And when it comes to scope 3, then we would be evaluating your current scope 3 categories that are included. And also, as Alex mentioned, that there's a certain criteria that if and only if your inventory consists of more than 40% of emissions that are coming from scope 3, would a company need to have a scope 3 target in place. So we would be evaluating that share category wise and demonstrating whether or not you would be requiring a scope 3 target. So note that here we would only be helping you to do checks and balances of your inventory, and if the whole organizational boundary is being taken into consideration as per the criteria and guidelines that are laid out by the initiative, and not developing a company's GHG inventory as such. So that's the first step. Moving on to stage 2, which is target development and modeling. Here, basically, as Alex mentioned, that across sectors, there are certain sectors for which we already have tools and methodologies in place, and for others, it's more open as to the other modeling techniques and the target development, criteria that are there. So here we would be, working with the company to select the appropriate methodology for developing the targets, then modeling their targets as per the inventory that you give us on scope 1 and 2, and selecting categories under scope 3 if and all a target is required, just to select the categories across which the company would want to work till the target, during the target frame time to achieve their targets. So here we would be, working with the company to provide them with the possible emission reduction target pathways, modeling them for them to achieve the required ambition. That is, whether the company would like to be under the well below 2-degree scenario, or it would like to adhere to the 1.5-degree scenario. Moving on, it's the validation support. Till here, for validation, there's a proper validation form that needs to go to the SBTI, and we would be also helping companies to make them understand on the various integrities of what the submission form entails, what needs to go in. It's a bit technical in nature, so companies usually face a problem in filling that. So we would be doing that for them. Basis which the target would be submitted to the initiative, and there can be two outcomes. One, the targets are not approved, for which we would be working again with the company, and second, which is a more likely situation, would be that the targets are approved, and there we will help you with the last stage, which is the communication support, where we would be helping companies develop a blog or a case study where we will showcase how the company is planning to achieve these targets, and that can be used by the company to share it across their stakeholders. So this is what we would be doing as part of the incubator process. Next slide, please. Yes. So basically now coming to giving you a scenario of what the Indian numbers look like and what the Indian companies are doing. So currently we have 40 Indian companies that have committed to the initiative, and this has propelled India to be at the 5th position, as you can see in the graph, after US, Japan, UK, and France. And definitely not to forget that this is the first emerging economy that has made its place in the initiative, and the numbers suggest that. So just to mention here that when we say 40, there is a representation and a good amount of representation from the SMEs and the companies that are there in the supply chain of corporates, as well as in addition to the big business houses that we have in India. So moving forth, you'll get to know as to which are the companies that have committed and developed their targets. Next slide, please. Yes, so this basically slides gives an overview. It does not have all the companies' logos, but just gives an overview as to which all companies are there, and across sectors. If you see, we've tried to put in the names. For example, you would see a good representation from the cement sector industry, from software and services. Then we have a lot of companies from the automobile and component sector. Heavy industries, for example, cement, I already said. Then we have chemicals companies that have committed to the initiative. Companies from the FMCG sector, financial services sector, software and services. Also not forgetting mining, steel, and construction companies. So if we see that there are a vast expanse of sectors that have been covered in the SBTI, and we are trying to work with the companies across sectors in order to get their targets approved as per the latest climate science. So we, as part of the incubator, are very, looking forward to work with companies across sectors and companies within the sector, so that there's maximum peer-to-peer learning, and we also, can work and can get companies to develop their targets in line with what the SBTI initiative, the criteria that are laid down by them. Next slide. Yes, so like I was mentioning, this slide shows the sector-wise breakdown of the companies. So if you can see, the red color bars show that these are the companies that have committed to the initiative, and the light red shows that they are the companies that have their targets set. So in India, as of now, we have 12 companies across sectors that we would be seeing in the upcoming slides that have got their targets validated. And if you see, major representation is coming again from sectors like automobile and components. Then a lot of supply chain companies are from the textile apparel sector. Then mining, which includes mining of metals. Steel sector companies are also there. Companies from the construction material sector, for example, cement sector companies, food and beverage, FMCG, real estate. So there's a vast, basically across the sectors, there is a presence felt in the companies that are committed to the initiative, and companies simultaneously also developing their targets. Next slide, please. Yes, so just giving the Indian numbers here, see if you can see, as I told you, there are 40 companies that have committed to the initiative, and out of these 40, we have 12 companies that have got their targets approved. Now, when we see this number 12, this is basically companies that have got their targets approved and are getting it approved since 2018. So the companies that are listed on the slide right now are the companies that have got their targets approved. And not to mention some specific companies here, for example, Shree Cement, that was the first Indian cement company that got its target approved early this year. Then we have Wipro, who has recently also signed a pledge, 1.5-degree pledge, which says that its right now targets are aligned as per the 2-degree scenario. But moving forward, they would be developing their targets in line with 1.5-degree. Then Mahindra Sanyal Special Steel, the only steel sector company, although they are into manufacturing of secondary steel, they are the ones who were the first Indian company to get their targets approved. And since then, they have been reporting and disclosing their emissions as part of their CDP response. And we can actually see, these companies, for example, Sanyo, Hindustan Zinc, Tech Mahindra, Wipro, the companies that have been the first runners in the SBTI initiative in India, how they are showing, emissions decrease year on year, and how they, are moving towards achieving their target. So moving on. Yes, so like I was telling, we have just collated a few companies, and we have worked with these companies to develop case studies for all the other companies, peer sector companies, all companies across the sectors, to just showcase as to what these companies are doing and how do they plan to achieve their science-based targets till their target year. So first we are looking at Tech Mahindra. So if you see, Tech Mahindra had a absolute target of reducing scope 1 and scope 2, and they had a target, they have a target till 2030, and they also have a 2050 target in place. So if we talk about Tech Mahindra, so they are taking on a host of initiatives to reduce their emissions across the scopes. So they are basically cutting diesel usage in company-owned vehicles when they want to work across scope 1, and to reduce their electricity wastage, the company is purchasing energy-efficient laptops. They are also, investing in natural cooling systems for their data centers, better air conditioning equipment, and installing motion sensors and low carbon lighting in all their campuses across the country. They basically consume right now approximately 18,500 megawatt hour of solar power through PPAs, and the company consumes 100% of the power that is solar power that they generate on site. And the company's major source of scope 3, although they don't have a scope 3, but they're also having emission reduction initiatives with respect to scope 3. So that basically includes employee business travel. So to reduce that, they're investing in remote communications such as teleconferencing, etc. The next company is Hindustan Zinc, which is into mining of precious materials. So they also have an absolute target and also a scope 3 target, because their scope 3 inventory was more than 40% of required. So they are shifting their operations. They are moving towards advanced low carbon energy savings. And they are also currently utilizing 100% of the solar power that is generated. And yes, so moving on, we have Mahindra Sanyal. So Mahindra Sanyal, like I said, was the first Indian company to get its target approved. And since then, they have been working to reduce their emissions across the scopes. So the company has invested heavily in energy efficiency processes. It includes installing, recently they've installed a 6 megawatt waste heat recovery boiler. And the company has made energy efficiency improvements across their buildings by installing low carbon lighting and motion sensors. What the company aims is that it consumes 32% of their total power from renewable energy sources, and by 2022 they want to enhance that by approximately 12%. Next slide is we've worked with Wipro. Now, Wipro, like I told you, they're looking forward to change their targets and pledge against the 1.5 degree targets. So basically, their on-site diesel-generated electricity makes up for most of the Scope 1 emissions, and Scope 2 is whatever is coming from the grid. So they have taken up measures that include rationalization and virtualization programs, then again replacing motors and drives, improving their air conditioning systems. Retrofitting has been one of the most sought after processes, change in process. Then procuring PPAs from procuring renewable energy from PPAs. They've increased their RE procurement through PPAs by approximately 40% according to the CDP data since 2015. They've also improved their access to public transportation for employees as part of reducing their Scope 3 emissions, and launched some things. They've taken up some initiatives like launching a carpooling mobile app, which has cumulatively saved more than 2,500 tons of CO2 in a year. So a company has also developed other processes of remote working, which helps them reduce their Scope 3 emissions for the category of business travel and employee commuting. So these are a few initiatives that companies are taking, and we would be very happy to work with other companies as part of this incubator to help them set science-based targets and see their journey towards achieving that science-based target. Now, that is all from our side, and we would be happy to take questions. And we would be also very happy if you could reach out to us on email or by phone if you have any kind of questions. And yes, just looking forward to see you as part of the incubator. Thanks, Varun. Over to you.
Thanks, Subodhika. Thanks for taking us through the SBT journey here in India. And I request all the attendees to kindly post in their questions. And Astha, if you could post the questions to me or Subodhika.
The offerings of Incubator. So we have got few questions, and I believe, Varun, you can take this one. So the question is, what do companies need to do in order to sign up for SBTs?
So that's fairly simple. You can reach out to us, you can write to us with your intent to sign up for the Science Based Targets Initiative, and we can take it up with the Secretariat and help you, assist you in filling up the form, a basic expression of interest thing that could be submitted to the Secretariat after a few steps of due diligence. We may ask you for your inventory to check, like if you have your GHG inventory in place or something. So it's very simple. So you can just write to us and we can pretty much take it on from there.
Okay, thank you, Varun. Subodhika, I guess you can take this one. Are there any prerequisites for companies who want to sign up for SBTs?
Yes, thanks for the question. So the prerequisite is that basically you need to have your GHG inventory in place when we talk about Scope 1 and 2. And for Scope 3, you need to have a proper screening done across the categories to just see as to, if you're measuring and monitoring your emissions across the relevant sectors. Other than that, once you have that in place, you are ready to go with your what do you call commitment letter, and then we can help you develop your targets further on.
Okay. One more question. Any certification program for individuals under SBTi? Varun, if you could take this.
Sure, Asa, thanks for the question. So right now, we do not have any such certification program or any such courses which could be taken up. But of course, we'll be taking up trainings and capacity building workshops that under the incubator, where you can get trained on various aspects of Science-Based Targets Initiative and how to choose the scenarios and target setting with the simple tools which are available for different sectors. So that is all for now. Any specific trainings or to be honest, certifications are not available for now.
Okay. So Bodhika, I believe you can take this one. Once the target is submitted, which is the best way to monitor the targets? Any specific tool?
So once the target is submitted, I believe you mean to say that the target has been approved. So year-on-year monitoring is usually done through the CDP disclosure questionnaire, climate change questionnaire, where there's an option where you can say that how X% decrease or X% increase in emissions have taken place over the last year. and saying that in the couple of years, this initiative itself is coming up with a monitoring tool which will, help companies to see how much are they basically achieving as per their what the target says, and also it gives a verification for to the initiative key, to just to see whether the companies are doing as per what they have to do. So that is in process, but yes, year on year companies do report to CDP as part of CDP's disclosure program to showcase their to showcase basically the decrease in emissions or increase, and if they are matching up to what the target says.
Okay. Varun, if you could address this question, is there any fees charged by the incubator for this help or offering that we have been serving companies?
So right now, there is no such fee that is being charged for helping you out with setting the targets or enrolling for the initiative and then even setting the targets. Though there is a validation fee which is applicable for developed countries, and that fee also has been waived off by the Science Based Targets Initiative Secretariat. So there is no fee for either enrolling or even signing up or validating, getting the targets validated.
Okay. So just one last question, I believe. So Bodhika, this you can take. What are the steps for the validation of the targets?
Yes. So if this question is what are the steps in the validation once you submit the form to the initiative, basically they have a screening process at their end where usually your form goes through a lead reviewer and an approved approver who would see whether the targets that you're proposing as part of your modeling and target development are as per the level of decarbonization that is required, and also as per what the climate science says, that is the IEA tools and what IPCC recommends. And once they see that okay, the targets are in line, and you have a specific sustainability roadmap that which serves the purpose of how would you be achieving these targets, then it is where the basically it's a green signal from them. And if we talk about the process before the validation, that I've already included in my presentation, that we would be going through checks and balances across the inventory, then moving forward to suggesting companies as to which modeling tool is the best suited for them, and then working with the company in order to take a sign off if they are okay with the kind of ambition that the tool is giving, or if we could work with them in some other way to get their targets validated. And lastly, helping the companies in filling up their validation form. So these are the two criterias, one upstream, and secondly once you submit the things for validation.
Okay, I believe this helps. So I believe we are done with the questions also. So thank you everyone for taking our time and participating in the webinar, and feel free to reach out if you have any queries. We would be happy to help. So yeah, over to you, Varun.
And also, yeah, thanks. Thanks, Asta, for posing the questions. And in addition to this, we will be sharing both the presentations which were covered during the webinar, and you can go through them. And if you have any other additional queries, we'll be more than happy to address your queries offline. And we'll also be announcing the next webinar in the series, where we'll be doing a deeper dive into the technical resources for the science-based targets, so that you can get an idea of what kind of scenarios could be used for setting the targets. And also we'll try to get a business representative who can talk about their journey of science-based targets for peer-to-peer learning. And in the meanwhile, if you are interested to join the Science-Based Targets Incubator, feel free to reach out to us on the email addresses mentioned, which you can see on your screens right now, and we'll be circulating the presentations. So do feel free to reach out to us for any kind of queries or questions that you would have. Look forward to connecting again in future, and stay safe and take care. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sabotika.